You're listening to the Balanced Educator Podcast, episode number 116. Welcome to the Balanced Educator. We're your hosts, Kaylee
and Josiane from EduCalm. Our intention is to equip and empower you to feel more calm, balanced, and joyful in all aspects of your life.
Hello there and welcome. We are so happy to have you here with us today. In this week's episode, we are interviewing Thomas Flakenberg. Thomas worked for about 10 years as a mathematics high school teacher in North Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, before he moved with his family to Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, to work as a professor in the Faculty of Education of the University of Manitoba in 2005. He is currently the Associate Dean for Graduate Programs and Research in the Faculty of Education. In his research and scholarship, he's been exploring a range of areas from mathematics, education, to teacher education, sustainability education, and to now, education for well-being and well-becoming. And that is what we're going to be talking to him about today. So the reason we invited him onto the podcast is because we had a few teachers that use our program that were asking, what is the best tool to measure student well-being so that they could see from the beginning of the school year to the end of the school year after using the EduCalm Classroom Social Emotional Learning and Mindfulness program, was there an improvement in student well-being? They were observing improvements, but they wanted to have some sort of concrete data to be able to, show this in a concrete way that there was improvements. So we started searching high and low for some sort of tool to measure student well-being, and we couldn't find anything. So we talked to one of our friends who is a psychology professor at Université de Saint-Boniface, and she's done a lot of research in mindfulness. And we asked her, there must be a tool out there. How do we measure student well-being? And she said, you know what? There really isn't anything that is out there that's good right now, but there is a professor at the U of M that is doing really great research on this, and you have to connect with him. So that's what we did. That is why we are bringing Thomas Flakenberg onto the episode today, and I am so excited to share this interview with you. We have an amazing conversation about well-being and well-becoming, about what needs to change in the school system, and how can we sort of measure this well-being and well-becoming. Before we get into the interview, we are so excited to share this week's sponsor, Time Timer. Time Timer is a visual timer that every classroom needs to have. This is a tool that we love using for classroom management, for time management within the classroom, for teaching our students how to measure time passing. And it's also clinically proven to increase self-regulation in children. So it's a really good way to help students to focus, to stay on task. We love that it is a visual timer. So it isn't just a clock that's counting down. It's a visual timer where you can see the color decrease as time passes. So it's really great as a tool to teach students about time. You have to check out Time Timer. I am loving their desktop app, but I also have a physical time timer that I inherited in one of my first classrooms where I was teaching, and it was a tool that I use so much and love using. So now that they have a desktop version as well, where I can have many different time timers going with different colors, different names. There are so many uses for this in the classroom. You have to check it out. Go to timetimer.com/educalm to learn more or to purchase your time timer. So again, that's timetimer.com/educalm, and educalm is spelled EduCalme. All right, we are so excited to share this interview with Thomas Flakenberg. Let's go to the interview. Hello there, Thomas. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Hi, Kelly. Nice to be here
We are
with
so
you.
excited to have you to share your expertise with our audience of teachers and parents. Can you explain how life led you to studying well-being and well-becoming in the school context?
Oh, that's a long question. Because I think I've arrived rather than at a different topic that I was interested in, more at an area of focus that I think brings all my concerns that I had in other areas, including in math education, together into one focus. It started out already when I made the decision to become a school teacher in Germany, where I grew up and was educated as a teacher. Uh, eh, with my experience in high schools, where I developed, through the influence of one particular teacher, an interest in what some might call the greater good and what education can contribute to that, and what it means for education. And so that brought me into education more generally. And once I moved to Canada and taught for a number of years in high school as a mathematics teacher, I wanted to go back and study more deeply what this could actually mean, the concern for what would I now call the well-being of students in the school system, and for the time after the school system, after they've left the school system. And so there were different approaches at that time. When I went back to studying, it was around first. Was quite popular at that time in British Columbia. Character education was an important part. So I studied in that area, read in this area, and then moved through the influence, the second important influence, who then became my supervisor in my doctoral work, was around ethics of care. So a much broader or a somewhat different approach than character education. And so if I look, and then I got this position here at the University of Manitoba in mathematics education. And even in mathematics education, I was linking it to the concern for, again, what I would now call students' well-being. It was a little bit asked differently: for what purpose do we actually educate mathematics? What is good for society more broadly, and for students in particular? And so then it expanded into sustainability education as one deeper concern for society more broadly, and then as I would say now, finally, although it's never finally, I'm still working on it and at it, then into well-being and well-becoming. And flourishing. And so that was then the language that I've taken on. But I'd say it has been with me for now. How long have I been in education? Well, probably 30 years, around 30 years in education. I think when I now look back, I'll see my concern and what I engage with at this stage of my own development, really as a kind of coming together of all these different concerns that I have as an educator, as a teacher, as a scholar, and as a learner myself.
That's wonderful. I love hearing how each step sort of built on the next, and that you are now studying something that is very interesting to us at EduCom, which is well-being and well-becoming. So I came across your work when I was looking for a way to, or a tool really, to share with teachers that wanted to measure well-being in their classrooms. And I found out quite quickly that that's not something that's easy to measure. So can you talk about your framework? I came across your paper and I read through it and I found it super interesting. So I'd love to dig into your framework on well-being and well-becoming.
Yeah, maybe I'll respond first to the measuring question. There are a few ideas around that I want to share with you and your listener. The first thing is, I think one should keep in mind that whatever you measure, the conceptualization comes first. Right? You have to have some sense of what is it that I actually measure. So when we go to how successful are we, especially in the educational realm, successful in implementing ideas or in our educational endeavors, we are thinking of measuring the success, or as I would like to call it more broadly, assessing our success. But we need to keep in mind that whenever we do this, we either explicitly and sometimes implicitly, or often implicitly, make assumptions about what it is that we actually measure. And depending on the measuring tools, we measure quite different things. And something like living a flourishing life, as you can imagine, is so complex. It's really difficult to say, oh, I'll measure flourishing. Now, there have been in the literature and in different approaches measuring tools or assessment tools developed that could be used, but they are all based on particular assumptions about what it means to flourish as a student and as a human being more generally. And so I think what the framework can provide is an engagement with this conceptualization question. What do I actually mean by flourishing? And we'll get to discuss this in more detail, I guess, in a moment, the framework. I think what is important to keep in mind is that the framework can provide this engagement that's necessary, but that we all as human beings and as teachers in particular are already engaged in assessing well-being, be it of our students, our own, or of our friends. Right? If a teacher sees a student coming in the morning with a frowning or not the usual self, as we might say, right? We attend to this as teachers or as parents or as neighbors, and we are curious. We want to know and we want to be supportive. And so this is already an assessment of somebody's well-being. And we have a kind of natural or let's say enculturated way of sensing somebody's well-being, whether somebody is well or not. Now, what a framework like this can do, and what ultimately also professional development for teachers can do, be it initial or in service, is to expand that repertoire and expand the conceptual understanding of what we are looking for when we mean flourishing and well-being. And so the one of the features of the framework that I've proposed in the paper that you were referencing is that it's integrated, and it integrates quite different approaches that have been taken in the literature on what it means to flourish. And I think what I want to suggest is it as important as wanting to assess how successful we are with certain educational strategies, as important it is to ask the question, what is it actually that I'm concerned about and concerned with? And that's where the paper could be quite helpful.
That's wonderful. I love just this whole framework and this way of thinking of these different areas of what does it mean to be well? What does it mean to flourish? So can you share, you have 5 components of well-being and well-becoming. Can you explain what each of these components are?
Yeah, this came out of studying some of the literature on flourishing and bringing some of what I thought were really insightful understandings by scholars from different traditions together, from philosophy and psychology, primarily a little bit from sociology, and it is based first on the idea, and that's where the idea of integration comes in, is to integrate 2 different general approaches to well-being and flourishing, living a flourishing life. One is that focuses on the here and now, on the being, so to say, right? This concerns then enjoying life, having meaningful relationships with others. But there's also a second line of thinking around flourishing, and that's in the capabilities approach in philosophy, and they focus less on the actual momentary experiences that somebody has, and the context in which one is embedded, and focuses more on the potential that we have to direct our life as agents of our life. And so that's where they focus most strongly on capabilities that people develop so that they can direct their life in certain directions. And that's a little bit of the component that we might talk about, the aspect of the framework that we might talk a little bit more about, is the becoming aspect, that we are constantly evolving, but the way we evolve and in which direction we evolve depends on the potential we have, the capabilities, using that language, the capabilities that we've developed.
Just to make sure that I understand this properly, so you have the well-being, which is my wellness in this moment. Would that be more like, how am I feeling? How am I doing? Am I healthy? Where is my mindset at? Would that be kind of like almost like the mindfulness aspect of this, the two sides of this sort of idea? The being is right now. Am I correct with that?
That is part of it, I'd say. So maybe I'll just mention briefly the 5 components that you mentioned, because the idea would be that each of the 5 components could be seen through the lens of well-being as well as through the lens of well-becoming. So the one,
now. Okay.
Yeah. So one is the capabilities, having capabilities to address your fundamental human needs. And the second one is that we are not just have these capabilities, but that we also have opportunities to engage these capabilities. So having the capability, let's say, to be a critical citizen in our society is one aspect. But if we don't get the potential to actually exert this agency, like, let's say, through community engagement in political matters or through elections, etc., then our well-being is undermined. The third component is enjoying life, and the fourth one, living a meaningful life. And the fourth one is the relationship. It's experiencing personal and communal relationships that contribute to one's well-being, so positive relationships. And each of these components can be seen from a momentary state that we are in. So we could ask question, what kind of capabilities do I have to actually let's say, live a sustainable life, if that is, you've considered that as part of living a flourishing life, or what opportunities do I have to actually exert those agencies? So, what is my socioeconomic conditions that allow me to join sports teams, for instance, right? Hockey, very popular in Canada, of course, is very expensive. And so many might have the capabilities, the interest, and thrive towards, but they might be limited by the economic status that they have, the funds, the resources that are available to them. The same with enjoyment, right? It plays a big role in our life, to enjoy our life. It's the being, right? But to bring now in the other perspective, the well-becoming perspective, we all know that tragedy in our life is just around the corner. So the trauma in a more broader sense, right, happens all the time on a regular basis, right? It might be the cat that we have affection for suddenly disappears, and that can be a traumatic experience. As we get older, people that are close to us die, and so there are traumatic experiences just waiting to happen. And so that means that from a well-becoming perspective, the focus is less on how do you feel at the moment. So I'm very sad because I had my cat ran away, and I don't know, I'm worried about it, and I don't know where the cat is. But the well-becoming aspect asks more, how resilient am I to overcome these traumatic experiences? So that might be an example to demonstrate how the well-becoming and the well-being are different, although they apply to the same components. And the same with the capabilities. My capabilities I need, let's say, as an elementary school student to live a flourishing life as a student are quite different of nature and extend then the capabilities I would need as a high school student and then as an adult. And so both do play a role. The well-being and the well-becoming.
Okay, that seems to be such a all-encompassing view of how we can live our own lives. So something that as teachers, I think this would be a really good professional and personal growth framework to look at for our own lives. And then also, how are we integrating these 5 components and the well-being and well-becoming sides of these 5 components into our teaching? So I'd love to talk about some concrete ways of how, as teachers, we can integrate these 5 components. So I'm just going to repeat them so they're top of mind for everyone. So we have, the first is having agentic capabilities linked to human needs. So that would be, to make sure I understand this correctly, that means that I kind of have agency over my own ability to fulfill my own needs. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
And then the second one is experiencing situational opportunities to engage one's agentic capabilities in relevant life domains. So having opportunities in my life to do the things that I want to do. Is that correct?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah. So that's the distinction, it expresses the distinction of having the potential on the one hand side, which is the first one you mentioned, and having actually opportunity to use that potential so that it leads to experiences of flourishing is the second component. Yeah.
Right. So that's like you expressed the question of, okay, so maybe I'm very naturally gifted in music. I'm really interested in learning how to play the guitar, for example. But if I never have the opportunity to buy a guitar or borrow a guitar that I can learn with, or have a teacher to teach me, or the resources I need to learn, then that's stopping me. So it's the interest and then also the opportunity to be able to fulfill that interest. And then the next one is enjoying life. That's pretty clear, bringing the joy factor into life. And that's something that I'm always working on in my adult life, like remembering that life is supposed to be fun. And same thing in the classroom, when you're a science teacher and a math teacher, and it can get easy as an adult to get really serious about the topics that you're teaching. So remembering to enjoy is so important.
Yeah.
And then the next one is living a meaningful life. So that is so important. And that's going to be different for everyone. So I'm excited to get into how we can integrate that into our teaching. And then the last one was experiencing personal and communal connections that contribute to one's well-being. So that's that community, and that can be in the classroom, that can be in the family, that can be in the larger community as well. So okay, here's our situation, and I want you to kind of coach me. I am going to be teaching a course that I'm very excited about this year. It's a high school course, grade 10, and it's personal finance. So this is a math elective that students get to choose to take, which I think is so important to teach in school. So as I'm planning my school year, how would you suggest that I think of these 5 components and how to integrate them into the year? So am I looking at each lesson and trying to integrate these 5 components in each lesson to ensure that I'm focusing on well-being and well-becoming in my classroom?
Maybe before I answer the specific question you ask, and this is understandable that you have to ask a concrete question because that's the daily life of us as teachers. I want to make sure that I don't miss the opportunity to emphasize that if we take the framework serious and the underlying idea of education for preparing for and living a flourishing life, it might require some rejigging of the education system and the constraints that exist. right? And there might or might not be an opportunity to talk about that. But one, to just be concretely in this case, right, the very fact that you get a prescribed curriculum with learning outcomes that you have to accomplish in grade 10 it might be a constraint that might be a constraint for actually implementing education for flourishing. But we leave that aside and just work with what.
Actually, you know what? Let's get into that, because I think that that's a really important thing for us to have top of mind before we get into the specifics. So we can circle back to the implementation, and let's get into the education system. So you said in your paper that your paper is called Framing Human Well-Being and Well-Becoming, an Integrated Systems Approach for School Education. And I'm going to be linking that in the show notes. So for our listeners, if you want to read this paper, it's wonderful. We have it linked on our website, so you'll be able to check that out. Now, I highlighted this because it really hit me when I read it in your paper. You said, if schooling is to develop agentic capabilities to address human needs needed for living a flourishing life, school curricula and teaching practices would need to give much more consideration to experiential and performative knowing in all curricula. So can you explain that and go into more detail of what kind of changes need to be made?
Let's draw on the first of the 5 features, which is the agentic capabilities linked to human needs. So the agentic being having agency over the development of the capabilities and developing them to a degree that you can use them as an agent means, for instance, some influence on the learning goals, some influence on the way that I demonstrate my learning, some influence, some voice in exploring beyond what might be the limitations of the curriculum, making some connections to other curricula. And it also means that the capabilities need to be the capabilities linked to math education. In your case, for instance, need to be linked to the larger question of how does this contribute to a student living a flourishing life currently, but also as an adult. And so I think in very broad terms, one of the challenges in our education system is really that it is primarily driven by external determinations, by what students have to learn. Now, there is clearly room for this, and I would not deny that. But there are wonderful examples I've seen in the school system, and interestingly, much more so in the elementary school system than in the high school system, which of course has some, we can come up with some explanations for that. Creative ways in which students' agency is actually developed in even subjects like mathematics, where there is some self-directedness of where students go, and where students develop also the kind of knowledge and depth of knowledge and understanding, which is generally in literature called performative knowledge, rather than the knowledge that I know the facts of mathematics, I know how to do these and those things with my skills. But then once I outside of the context of the school system or the math class, then I'm actually reverting back to my old way of understanding mathematics and mathematical problems in the world. And so the performative knowledge is really linked to the meaningfulness in the larger context in which a child lives.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a question that I've learned to ask over the years, just in my observations of what sticks with students. So as a science teacher, as a math teacher, when I'm teaching, just these straightforward math or science skills, is that going to stay with them? And I've had lots of reflections on, I did my bachelor degree in science, and I remember just all the things that I just had to memorize when I was in university. And those things just didn't stick with me. But then the types of projects that I did that were connected to experience, and I could connect it to my own life, were the things that really stuck with me and the skills that really stuck with me. So that's a question that I ask as I'm developing my lessons is, how does this, what's in it for the student? Why do they care about this? How does it connect to their own personal life? And I've noticed that when I take that lens as I'm developing my lessons, that students are more engaged, they're more interested, and it sticks with them, rather than if you're just doing, like you said, those performative tasks where you're memorizing and then just regurgitating it onto a test. That doesn't stick with them.
Mm-hmm. And maybe that could be explained through the importance of meaningfulness for living a flourishing life. Right? If we have, as human beings, we thrive towards what lets us be and become well. And so while we can be forced to sit in a classroom and even be successful in certain activities, that doesn't mean that we are truly engaged in these activities, and so the meaningfulness does play an important role, and so subjects. So I don't want to suggest that subjects have to be always enjoyable, and sometimes we have to recognize that there's a distinction between enjoying something at this stage or not enjoying something at this stage, but being meaningful for your future life, because you want to have a career in a certain area that requires studying certain subject areas. So I think that might be a good approach for teachers to think through the lens of meaningfulness, making it meaningful to student. Right? And there are a range of conceptual understanding of meaningfulness in the context of teaching subjects. Right? One could be, well, the meaning, of course, of the concepts and the subjects and the things that we want to teach them. Let's say percentage, using of percentage, making sense of borrowing. And where are your limitations, financial limitations for that? And we might not be interested in that at this stage, but we might recognize this as being meaningful for living my life and making those connections. And clearly, meaningfulness in the sense of significance, in the sense of, well, how significant is this for me, is an important component for all of us, whether we are adults or children, and in learning. Right? So if we recognize it is significant for me, and it could be a derived way of significance, it doesn't mean knowing this particular concept is really significant for me, but being successful in this course can be significant for me, because that gives me the credits that I need in order to get into the university program, for instance, or the technical program that I want to get into. So the significance and the variety of making something significant or meaningful to students is clearly one approach in which the more externally determined learning experience in the school system and the flourishing of the students can be brought together.
Yes. It just makes me think of, every single teacher has always heard a student ask, when am I ever going to use this in my life?
Yes.
So being able to, direct your lessons in ways that it's easier for students to answer that question, or at least how you can answer that question, brings meaning to it. And that's one of those 5 components that you outline. I love also, before, I just want to cycle back to this, because you had mentioned how does this contribute to our students living a flourishing life? I think that's such an important question to ask ask ourselves as teachers in whatever we are doing in our classroom. How is this contributing to them living a flourishing life? Because it can get so easy to just look at the curriculum. As you said, it's not quite built in a way yet that considers, is this information that we're teaching our students going to contribute to them living a meaningful life, a flourishing life? So until that becomes the case one day, as you continue your work, and I'm sure people will build on your important work, eventually the curriculum is going to change to encompass that. But in the meantime, just asking ourselves the question of whatever curricular outcome I am covering with my students, how am I ensuring that the way that I teach it is contributing to them living a meaningful life? And then to have, I'm seeing myself having your 5 components listed somewhere on my desk so that I can just refer back to it and make sure that what I'm doing, okay, am I checking at least one of these boxes, in everything that I'm doing to ensure that I'm teaching the whole child?
Yes, I think rather than, and I'm not suggesting that's what you had in mind, but rather than thinking of these as or creating from each of these 5 components of flourishing separate learning outcomes, keeping those more in mind as lenses through which activities you engage in. So in some sense, the activities that you do might not change per se or too much. You might use activities that you've used before, or if it's a new course, right, that you have just developed with the learning outcomes in mind. But the way in which you engage these activities, the ways in which you engage with students in these activities, the way you respond, the way you assess, keep these lenses in mind. So let's take the capabilities component in mind, that you try to ask the question, well, how does what I have planned develop? What kind of capabilities will it develop? Right? And the same with meaningfulness, right? Am I clear to students? Do I help them develop a meaningful relationship to the subject, to the topic, to the concepts? And what would meaningfulness mean, right? In terms of, again, the distinction, I understand what it is. I know what it means in the overall understanding of mathematics, but also how significant is it for me personally, and then also linking it beyond the subject itself, because some of the questions, some of the justification for exposing students to certain subject areas and to certain concepts and ideas that many students might not buy into, is really the stepping back and looking at the larger question of how important is this to their life as human beings, and so making these connections as well, right? So that students see, yes, I might not be very interested in the subject, but I know I need it for graduation. And so if someone sees significance in one's own life in taking the course and being successful, one might actually meaningfully engage with the activities, although they don't see immediate relevance to their life in those activities.
Right. So looking at it in many different ways. So not everything has to necessarily be relevant to every single students' lives in a really concrete way, but as long as it's kind of bigger picture evident to them why, for some reason, this is significant for me and my well-being or my well-becoming.
Yes, and I think that latter point is crucial. Like being explicit with students, engaging with them explicitly in the question, how might this contribute to my flourishing, either as student or now or as an adult, and that is another important part in teaching, and that doesn't matter which subject area it is to engage students in this very question. how does what I do, how does learning mathematics, how does engaging in mathematics, how does adults determining what I have to learn actually can be part of a flourishing society. And that might help students find more meaning in something that they find not very enjoyable.
Right. I love the idea of having conversations around this with our students. That's something that with our mindfulness program for the classroom, we suggest that teachers have conversations around that often with their students of how is doing this practice helping you in your life? Because we really find that with those conversations, students start thinking of how to use the tools and the strategies that they're learning, not just in the classroom or not just during the mindfulness practice, but in other areas of their life. They start making those connections through the conversations. And then also having that conversation of why it's meaningful to student one allows student two to recognize, oh, okay, I see how you're using it. Yeah, maybe I could use it in that way too. So it just creates this richer understanding of how what they're learning can be useful for them personally.
Yeah. And I think just to expand on this even further, what teachers might want to consider is also bringing in their own attempts and living a flourishing life. Because teachers are very influential, and of course, depending on high school, it becomes less so than it is in elementary school. But nevertheless, as I gave the example from my own life, teachers can be very influential on students. And so seeing and I use this in quotation marks, struggle of everyone, including the teachers, in trying to live a flourishing life, and some of the challenges that we'll face, right? Some of the, let's say, the caffeine addictions that we might live with, that they see that this is something that everybody is concerned with. We just often don't talk enough about it. And make it harder, or leave it up to students, or to discover it themselves, or not to discover it, which would be very sad.
Being transparent, I think more and more is something that teachers are doing on purpose, sharing more about themselves with their students, because it develops those connections and allows your students to see you not as just this kind of perfect teacher figure that never gets anything wrong, but showing them that there are ups and downs in life, and here are some strategies that we can use to get through those. It's so much more useful for our students to be able to see us modeling the strategies that we personally use to live a flourishing life. So that's such an important point to make. So I'd love to know now, what are some ways that your framework can help educators respond to really the increasing concern for student well-being in the Canadian school education system? Well-being and well-becoming is something that is being talked about more and more. There are more divisions and districts that are making this part of their division-wide goals. So how can they start using this framework to ensure that they're responding to student well-being and those concerns?
Yeah, I think the way it's currently developed, it is really as a framework for conceptualizing well-being. And as I said before, if you choose well-being as a focus of your education, or one of the foci of your education program, if you're concerned about this, then you'll have to face, if you want to assess how successful you are, then you clearly want to have an understanding and make it explicit what you actually mean by this, by living a flourishing life. And so that's what the framework can be helpful for. It can engage educators in that very question, and make some suggestions of what it could look like. And I do hope that it is quite integrative, and it's quite rich in terms of bringing different ideas from different traditions together. So it provides a basis for answering the why question. Why do I do this? So that there is also a justification for a specific action that you decide to take in the classroom towards the students, towards your colleagues, towards your administration and the parents, the public more generally, because that's important. We trust the education system with our children, and so there is a responsibility and can be expected from the public. So that it provides a foundation for answering the why question. The second, how it can be used by teachers. I'm not sure whether this is the right place. I'm making back to the question of the concrete question that you were asking. I think because this is a big question about what do we mean by flourishing. I think teachers should be careful not to feel overwhelmed, and because as teachers, we are, and I see this in my work with teachers in the school system. They are very busy with even just the day-to-day work, and so this idea of let's call it education for flourishing life, should not be an add-on, but it should be rather something that frames the work that teachers are doing. So let's say teaching the grade 10 course that you're preparing for the fall. And so using this really as a lens through which one can question and guide one's own practice and one's own ideas, and I think we all, as I gave the example at the beginning, we all have, as human beings living in the community, living with others and being in relationship at school, have already a sense of flourishing and well-being, and expanding that quality and that competency further, and developing the sensitivities that we need in order to guide our practice, but also to guide our encounters with our students on a daily basis. Right? So it's not just for the planning, but it can be also helpful for interrogating our day-to-day encounters with students and other colleagues in the school, so that it's not just a matter of planning lessons, but it can be a guide of how I interact with you, how I interact with my colleagues, where we might ask questions of what's the quality of our communal relationship within the school among colleagues, for instance, or teachers to students. So it opens up many questions that could be asked, and at this stage, it's really more a system that provides opportunity to ask questions rather than providing already answers.
I love that. And I'm so happy that you shared that, because I think that that's going to make it, like you said, not feel overwhelming. This isn't an add-on. It's just a lens through which you're looking at the practices you're already doing. And in my situation, I'm developing a couple new courses this year that have never been taught at the school that I'll be teaching at. So it's brand new. So it's kind of this open space for me to design what I want to design. So I will definitely be using your framework to question, as I'm creating lessons, am I considering the flourishing of my students as I'm developing this, and what are they going to get out of this that's going to contribute to their well-being and their well-becoming. But in a course that I've taught before that I'll be teaching again, I can just use this as a questioning process for the things that I am doing. The language that I'm using, the way I'm presenting it to my students, can I be a little bit better in the way that I present it to make sure that I'm looking at it through this flourishing lens? And also, maybe I'm already doing a better job than I thought I was. That can feel good too, to just sort of audit yourself and check in with yourself and see that you're probably doing a lot of this already, which is great.
Yeah. and to circle back to the assessment question that you asked earlier, I think it's really for teachers to build on practices that they are using, often informally, often maybe just in terms of the building of the relationship with the students rather than the subject matter, but just expanding that. So the question of, well, how are you doing today? Right, could be expanded, which is more maybe a concern for somebody's mental health, students' mental health who comes in, and mental well-being who comes into the class or had to miss class last week for some reasons. Expanding that into, well, how are you doing with the mathematical ideas that we were engaging with? What's your relationship to those subjects? Do you find meaning in that, or do you find meaning in or do you have relationships built? Do you feel you're part of the classroom community? And right, so us as among math learners. It's drawing on what already exists, what one is already doing now through a different lens, and then maybe expanding further from often non-subject matter-related questions where we often find our concern for the well-being of somebody else to now including the subject matter focus. Right? So as I gave the example, right? The meaningfulness question is now, well, how's your life going more generally? To how's your life as a math learner going? Right. Is there anything that I can help you with? Are you? Right? Yeah.
That's great. Really awesome advice. And I think this is really something that is doable. It doesn't feel overwhelming. It's so great to have a framework to be able to draw from so that we can know, am I doing it's nice to base things in research. You've taken the time to draw from what does it mean to be well? What does it mean to live a flourishing life from not just one viewpoint, but from many traditions and many areas of study. And I think it's just a really great starting point for us as teachers to be able to assess for ourselves. Are we integrating the flourishing of our students into our teaching? So I am really excited to implement this school year, and both in my interactions with my students, but also with my colleagues, and also as something to consider for my own well-being as I'm going into this school year. So thank you so much, Thomas, for sharing your expertise with us and your work with us. If anyone wants to follow your work or get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do so?
There are two websites that would reflect my work, and if somebody wants to get in contact with me or wants to follow, one is my professional website, which is thomasfalkenberg.ca, and the other one is from our research group, and it's called wellbeinginschools.ca. It's all one word, wellbeinginschools.ca. And this latter website is one that reflects some of the work that I, but also some of my colleagues have been doing, and has some other links to interesting websites, including this website also has the link to, well, actually posts the paper that you were referencing. And there is another one posted there as well on student voice and the link to well-being.
Wonderful. We will link both of those websites in our show notes as well, so it'll be nice and easy to find. Again, thank you, Thomas, so much for being with us today and for the important work you're doing in the world and in the education system. I just really feel excited for what your work is going to do to improve our education system, to have a bigger focus on student flourishing. So thank you.
Thank you, Kaylee. Thank you for having me.
I am so happy that I was able to do this interview with Thomas Flakenberg before going into this school year, because it has given me lots to think about, and I feel like I have a really good framework now, thanks to his framework, for how the lens through which I'm going to be looking as I develop my lessons for this school year, as I'm going to be teaching 2 new courses. I hope that this was really helpful for you too, and that it's going to give you things to ponder and consider and reflect on as you go into this school year. If well-being and well-becoming is a priority for you this school year, definitely check out our resource that will help you to integrate mindfulness and social-emotional learning into your classroom in a no-prep way. Our program is called EduCalm Classroom, and you get daily audio-guided mindfulness practices that are created specifically for the classroom. You'll get lesson plans, you'll get activities, all sorts of ways to integrate well-being, mindfulness, social emotional development, emotional intelligence into your daily classroom routine in a way that doesn't take up too much time. And in fact, teachers that use our program tell us that they gain back so much time because this program helps their students to prepare their brains for learning, and they are more focused and ready to learn after having listened to those audios. You can get started with this program for free by going to educalm.com and signing up for our free trial. For the show notes on this episode, go to educalm.com/TBE116. So EduCalm is EduCalme.com/TBE as in the Balanced Educator 116. All right. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. We appreciate you and truly value the work you're doing in this world. If you enjoyed this episode, definitely share it with a friend or a colleague. Have an awesome week.